We are going to be airing a series of broadcasts from now up until and including April the 15th on the criminal activities of the Nazi Gestapo jackbooted thugs called the Internal Revenue Service. They're unconstitutional, and what they're doing is unlawful. We're going to expose every single bit of it. We continue now with the testimony of Mr. Larry Beecraft. He is an attorney at law who's been involved for many years in income tax cases.
I will kind of recover some of the grounds that Bill was talking about. One of my favorite states to show that as an example of a state that failed to ratify the 16th Amendment is that of Kentucky. You heard Bill a few moments ago talking about what Kentucky did. February 8, 1910, the proposition. Now, the House had, before that time, had adopted the 16th Amendment, and obviously they had mailed evidence of the ratification by the House in Kentucky to Philander Knox in Washington, D.C. Why do we know that? Because that is part of the documentation that Bill discovered down at Archives, just down the street. Well, what did the Kentucky Senate do? Well, the Kentucky Senate, on that date, voted on the amendment, and the government claims the Kentucky Senate adopted the 16th Amendment on that date, but when you go to the legislative journals, you see, as Bill said, there were 9 votes in favor, 22 opposed. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that we can definitely consider that it is quite obvious and crystal clear that Kentucky did not ratify the 16th Amendment. So now we're down from 38 to 37. Well, let's take another one of my favorite states that I like to talk about, Oklahoma. What did Oklahoma do? Very similar to Kentucky. One house of the Oklahoma legislature ratified the 16th Amendment, and it was perfect. However, when the action of that body, the resolution, was sent over to the other body, maybe the Senate, what they did is they deliberately changed the wording of the 16th Amendment. Now, the 16th Amendment had a very clear purpose. In 1894, the United States Supreme Court had struck down, as unconstitutional, the 1894 federal income tax. Because of the decision in this, what we call the Pollock case, the 16th Amendment had been proposed to kind of circumvent the constitutional problem created by this decision. So in 1913, it was alleged that the 16th Amendment was ratified. It reads, there's 30 carefully drafted words. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. Now, that's a whole bunch of words. That's 30 words. They have a very specific meaning. However, the Oklahoma legislature came out and changed the amendment to read the exact opposite. Rather than requiring or eliminating the apportionment requirement for income taxes, the Oklahoma legislature demanded that income taxes be imposed and subject to the regulation of apportionment. Now, that's kind of complex language. But it clearly demonstrates that you cannot consider, a rational person cannot consider that Oklahoma ratified the amendment because it means the exact opposite of what the 16th Amendment itself says. Now we're down to what, 36 states? Let's just pick another state out of the blue, California. California deliberately engaged in modifications of the 16th Amendment. If you sit down and read what they allegedly adopted, besides the defects that Bill's talking about, there's no evidence of a vote by the California legislature. You cannot make sense of what the California resolution allegedly adopting the 16th Amendment means. It appears to be the product of a drunken sailor. Now, that brings us down to 35 states. Do we not have an argument? Remember, the government says it's not some flaky idea I concocted. It's not a wild theory that Bill Benson concocted. But the government says the power to tax incomes is predicated upon the 16th Amendment. Well, let's accept their proposition. If they say that the taxing power is predicated on the 16th Amendment, then if we have evidence that discloses the failure of the American people, the failure of the states to ratify the 16th Amendment, wouldn't it be logical to argue that there is no power to tax? Yes, very logical. Well, now I have just shown to you very quickly that 3 states failed to ratify the amendment. And it looks like to me we've got a very solid legal argument that we can go to court with and say, hey, you can't convict these people. You can't impose taxes on these people. Well, that's exactly what we did. Bill Benson finished the state of Washington December 22nd, 1984. We assembled, he and I and another friend of ours assembled on December the 28th, 1984 in Kokomo, Indiana, and we made a decision. The first case we're going to raise this issue in is the Janie Ferguson case, which was then set for trial January the 15th of 1985. New Year's Day, 1985, I draft the first motion to attack the ratification of the 16th Amendment. We go to court on January the 15th, 1985. Bill comes to court with 8 or 9 states that are defective, and we present our evidence to the judge. And between that date of January 15th, 1985, all the way up through the next 3 years, in a variety of cases across the country, we raised this question of the non-ratification of the 16th Amendment. And guess what we had in the way of a response from the American federal judiciary? Before I tell you what they did, let me tell you what the states have done with similar issues. Like in Alabama, if we have an argument, a legal argument that an amendment hadn't been ratified, we can march into court and our courts will consider that question. We did it back in 1983, this case called Alabama against Manley. We attempted back in 82 to totally redraft the Alabama Constitution with an amendment. And the issue was raised in Alabama at the time, can we do that? Is it legal? And the Alabama Supreme Court said, no way, Jose. Well, you know, there's a wide variety of state courts that have likewise similarly handled questions of this nature. So the states obviously can tell you that they can consider judicially the question of an amendment to a constitution. Well, we received the exact opposite answer from the federal courts. The federal courts disclaimed any authority to deal with this question of the ratification of the 16th Amendment. Now, I can obviously understand the reasons why. When you take a look at the amount of receipts that the federal government derives from the income tax, you know, it takes a very brave man to sit there and say, this power is out the window. And, of course, that was the reception that we received in a wide number of cases where we raised this issue. The courts said, oh, we can't do anything about this. In essence, what the courts told us to do is take this silly little problem down the hall to Congress. They are the guys that will resolve this question. Well, Bill Benson happened at the time to live 2 doors down from a lawyer by the name of Marty Russo. At that time, that lawyer, Marty Russo, was a representative in Congress. He was Bill Benson's representative in Congress. And Bill one evening went down and knocked on Marty's door. And Marty came to the door and said, well, Bill, what can I do for you? And Bill proceeds to outline his whole argument in his book. He says, I've got all this evidence here. Marty, we've been to court. Guess what? You as a lawyer should know what this means. The courts are saying that this is a political question. And Marty thinks about it for a minute, and he acts like the courts. Whoa, I don't want to have to resolve this question. This is not a political question. It's one for the courts. And they must decide the question of whether or not we have an amendment. Now, I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but I find that this situation that we've got here in America to be deplorable. Not only has Bill been told by his congressman that it's a political question, it's a judicial question, one for the courts. This man right over here with the gray beard, John Justice, back in 1987, and Bill, they sent out Volume 1 of Bill's book to all congressmen, all federal judges, all U.S. attorneys, all the governors, and he asked them, under our right to petition the government for redress of grievances, he asked for action from the political branch on this question. Do something about it. And the voice that we received back, the replies were, we won't do anything about it. It's a question for the courts. Now I ask you this. You know, the United States Supreme Court says that we have a right to know whether a law exists. It only makes sense. We have the evidence that can prove that the 16th Amendment was not adopted as required by the amending provisions of the United States Constitution. You can rely on that. And we presented this issue to the courts, and they point their fingers to Congress, and Congress points their fingers back to courts, and those are the only two branches that have anything to do with ratifying an amendment to the United States Constitution. And I ask this simple question. Aren't we, if we are entitled to know whether or not a law exists, are we not being subjected to a monumental due process problem, very similar to that faced by Miss Kritzer? Remember the lady that was told she doesn't have to file income tax returns by the Bureau of Indian Affairs? A couple of years later, the IRS says, no, she was wrong. She was required. Are we not being subjected to an identical situation? Is this not a monumental due process problem that is being presented to all of the American people as a result of the acts of Congress and the federal courts? But not only does the American people face this monumental problem, let me kind of really quickly summarize another problem that we all have. You know, there's two types of taxes that the United States Constitution authorizes Congress to impose. One's a direct tax, one's an indirect tax. It's only logical that the income tax should fall within one of those two constitutional classifications. The amazing proposition is that if you sit there and read the decisions of the federal courts, what do they say? Where does the income tax fit constitutionally? Well, some federal courts say, well, gee, it's a direct property tax. Other federal courts say the exact opposite. It's an excise tax. When you get down to the state level, the states are the exact opposite, but you still see the same problem. Most of the state courts say an income tax is an excise tax, but again, that's a rule subject to an exception, because the minority view is that it's a direct property tax, which incidentally is the majority view at the federal level. Now, doesn't that make sense? But the only thing that makes sense is this, that here in America, our system has told the American people that if you look into the constitutional foundation for this particular tax, the only thing that you will confront is uncertainty of the law, and uncertainty of the law creates a due process problem. You know, the folks that have formed the Wallace Institute, we want to do something to correct the ills in America. I think that there are a tremendous number of problems that are created by the government. And if we want to increase liberty and freedom in this country, we're going to have to get up off of our comfortable rear ends and do something about it. But I've taken my own personal survey. People call me up. They might have a tax problem, or they're contemplating, gee, these questions regarding the income tax. And the majority opinion or view or goals of the people with whom I talk are these. Well, I just want the IRS to leave me alone. I just don't want to be bothered by the government. Well, there's a class of people that these classes of individuals were best described by one of our founding fathers back at the time this country was founded. Those are the people that won't basically something for nothing. They don't want to protect their liberty. They want somebody else to do it. And they are best described as those individuals that match this description. If ye love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude better than the animated contest of freedom, go home from us in peace. Crouch down and lick the hands that feed you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen. Now, those are the people, once you go out and identify who they are, the best thing to do is move on. If we identify an opposite class of people, those who are willing to help us correct the ills of America, we can do it. And I would suggest there's the great potential that within the next 5 years, if the American people will exercise their political power, if they will confront government and they will do it actively, we can change America. And we need to become people like Patrick Henry. You remember what Patrick Henry had to say. Is life so dear, a peaceless sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains or slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I ask not what course others may take, but as for me, as for the other members of the Wallace Institute, give us liberty or give us death. Now, if we go out with that same attitude of Patrick Henry, we can change America for the better. Thank you very much.
To give you some idea of what people are doing by way of tax reform, let's hear from Dan Mitchell, a senior fellow, a senior economist at the Heritage Foundation. Dan.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. And I want to welcome everyone here. I know a lot of you have come from outside of Washington, and so I wanted to add my welcome to Washington, D.C., America's work-free drug zone. And I want everyone to sort of stop and take a deep breath, because there's a little bit of freedom in the air. Not quite yet, but Congress is about to go out on their 4th of July recess, or as they call it, a district work period. And since Will Rogers so aptly said that no man's life, liberty, and property are safe while the legislature is in session, I think we can shortly expect that no bad laws will be imposed upon us during that period when they are all out of town on their district work period. But I'm here to talk about what are the alternatives, what might happen if some of the events discussed by other panelists come to pass.
Folks, before you get all wrapped up in what you are about to hear, let me warn you. What Daniel Mitchell is about to propose is not only unconstitutional, but extremely dangerous to our freedoms. For those of you who know and understand the Constitution as I do, you will spot the unconstitutionality of this proposal instantly. And then as you listen to him as he goes along, you will also spot the danger. Tremendous danger to us all. I don't know how the Heritage Foundation can call this man what he has just been introduced to be, unless, number one, none of them have studied the Constitution and in truth could not possibly know anything about it, or number two, this is a subversive proposal meant to do the damage that if it ever becomes law, it is most certain to do. So pay attention to this and understand that a national sales tax or a flat tax is unconstitutional. And they've been talking about the unconstitutionality of it through this whole presentation. It's a direct tax. The federal government does not have the authority given to them by the Constitution to tax you at your cash register within the territorial boundaries of your state. They only have authority over interstate commerce and international commerce to levy excise taxes and only upon the first sale within that international or interstate commerce. So, if you don't understand all this, get out your copy of the Constitution and study it thoroughly. And listen to this guy and understand that he could be proposing this innocently, not understanding the limits placed upon the federal government by the Constitution for the United States of America, or he could be the enemy.
We have viewed at the Heritage Foundation, we have viewed the tax system through a prism of the Constitution. Not in the sense of the issue talked about here, but in the sense that we believe that a tax system should fulfill the Constitution's promise of equal treatment under the law. In other words, the law should apply equally to all. Now, what this means is that there should be no special treatment or subsidy or reward for some people who happen to have a special access to the powerful in Washington, and neither should there be any special penalty imposed upon those who happen to be in disfavor among the elites in Washington. And that means that you should have a system that doesn't penalize you on the basis of how you earn your income. It shouldn't penalize you on the basis of how you spend. And it shouldn't penalize you on the basis of the level of income or wealth or consumption that you have. You want the law to treat everyone equally. And what does that mean? It means that whatever your tax code is, it should tax economic activity only one time. I mean, it's bad enough to give the government one bite at the apple, don't give them twice, and then tax at one rate. And if you have a tax code that fulfills those two very simple principles, you're going to have something that, as an economist, I would love to drone on endlessly about how that's going to be good for our economy, but perhaps even more importantly, from a moral and from a philosophical and a constitutional perspective, we will have satisfied the notion of equal treatment under the law. Now, much of what the Heritage Foundation has done within the guidelines of those principles has been to work on the flat tax. But what happens if, knock on wood, good news happens, and somehow the courts or the politicians say, well, you can't have any direct tax on income, and that means even a simple, fair, low-rate income tax like a flat tax can't happen. What does that mean? Well, fortunately, there is more than one way to skin the cat. Now, mind you, when you were up here talking earlier, Bob, what would happen if the income tax went away? I do briefly get tempted to think that we could somehow survive, as this country survived from 1776 to 1913 with neither a sales tax or an income tax, but I guess I'm maybe a little old-fashioned. I mean, if we didn't have any kind of big, broad-based tax, we might not have any money to give to corrupt socialist governments to prop up their economies around the world. We might not be able to pay people to have children out of wedlock and destroy families in the inner city. We might not have money for the Department of Education that bogs down teachers with red tape so they have a harder time educating our kids. And so, of course, I guess we do need some revenue source so the government can continue to carry out all these very important functions. Well, what is the alternative? There is an alternative that I think very clearly satisfies those principles that I laid out earlier, and that's a national sales tax. Now, before I tell you what a national sales tax is, let me tell you what it isn't. Because if I tell you what it isn't, that's going to tell you that it's a pretty good idea. First of all, it's not 17,000 pages of code and regulations that accompany our income tax. And this, by the way, doesn't include all the tax court decisions and IRS letter rulings. It is not 5.5 million words, many of them inconsistent with each other, that define our current income tax code and regulations. It is not the 569 different forms that our current income tax requires that are available on the IRS's own webpage. And to give you actually an idea of how bad the system is, I just can't resist. This is one of my, I guess it's not a favorite anecdote, maybe it's least favorite anecdote. In 1997, Money magazine sent a hypothetical family's tax return to professional tax preparers, CPAs, people who presumably knew what they were doing. They got back 45 answers. All 45 were different. All 45 were wrong. And fewer than 1 in 4 were even within $1,000 of the right answer. And by the way, who even knows whether Money Magazine's panel of experts came up with the right answer? And this actually caused a little bit of a stir in Washington. Our elected officials got right to business, and they passed the 1997 Taxpayer Relief Act. Well, I think the only relief it gave was to tax lawyers and accountants, because that one law created 285 new sections of tax law and amended 824 others. And so when Money Magazine in 1998 did the same survey of sending out a hypothetical family's tax return, and remember, hypothetical family, not General Motors, not Bill Gates, but a hypothetical family. This time, they got back 46 answers. Once again, all 46 were different from each other, and all 46 were wrong. And this time, instead of just 1 in 4 being within $1,000 of the alleged correct answer, the closest answer to the alleged correct answer was off by $610, and the average mistake was more than $5,000. That's the tax code that we have today. This is what a national sales tax would not be. And by the way, of course, I love the fact that under our current tax code, that your normal constitutional protections do go out the window. You are presumed guilty until you prove yourself innocent. So in other words, you have fewer constitutional protections than Timothy McVeigh and O.J. Simpson and everyone else out there who robs, kills, rapes, murders, pillages, you name it. Of course, I guess what the IRS does is pillages, but I'll try to keep those editorial comments out of here. So that's what a national retail sales tax is. And what is it? What it is very simple. And I'll just assume that it's a 20% rate. You know, obviously the rate would depend on the size of the government. But since I'm not a math genius, let's keep 20% in case I have to do any calculations. A 20% tax on all final consumer purchases of goods and services. Now, this is a little bit different than what you're probably familiar with if you're from one of the 45 states with a sales tax. Everything would be taxed. In most states, for instance, you don't tax services. In most states, you have special penalties on some products like tobacco that are viewed as politically incorrect. But the view of a national retail sales tax is that we want to fulfill that constitutional promise of equal treatment, and so you don't want special subsidies for some products or services, special penalties imposed on others. So one flat, low rate imposed on all final consumer purchases. Why do I say final consumer purchases? Why not purchases from one business to another? You don't tax purchases from one business to another because that causes cascading and double taxation. And it creates an incentive then for businesses to become just giant vertically integrated conglomerates. And the example that I will give you that I think makes the most sense, at least to me, is that if we tax the sale from the tree farmer, I guess, I don't know what you call tree farmers, but the tree farmer to the lumber mill, and then you tax again the transaction from the lumber mill to the furniture maker, and then you tax the transaction from the furniture maker to the wholesaler, and then again from the wholesaler to the retailer, and then you levy another tax at the level of the retailer. Guess what? You're taxing the one product that the consumer buys at the end, 5 or 6 times? And that would obviously create a huge incentive for one company to simply vertically integrate and have all of those operations under one roof. And we don't want the tax code to be dictating how the economy is functioning. We want the tax code to do one thing and one thing only. Collect whatever amount of money the government demands, hopefully a small amount, but that's up to the political process, and to do so in a way that is going to be as least intrusive and as least damaging and as least distortionary to the economy, while also fulfilling the promise of treating all citizens equally under the law. What sort of compliance would you have with the national retail sales tax? You as an individual would have none, zip, nada. No more tax system for you. The closest you come to a tax system as a consumer, as an individual under a national retail sales tax, is you buy products. And there's a tax that's part of that product. And by the way, it's very important that tax should be visible. You don't want to make the mistake that the European socialist stagnant economies have made with value-added taxes that are built into the price of a product, and so when you buy it, you don't know how much the government is taking from you. Whereas if you have a very clear national retail sales tax where it's on your cash register receipt that you paid 20% more because the government wanted to spend this money, then you have a way of deciding, is this price that I'm paying too much for government? Is government giving me 20 cents on the dollar worth of goods and services? Now, I would think the answer would be no, and we'd put pressure to bring that rate down. But again, that's a question for the political process. So you would have nothing to do with the tax code as an individual. If you're a business, you would basically do what you do now if you're in one of the 45 states with a sales tax, except it would be much simpler because you wouldn't have to calculate, which products have taxes and which products don't. You would simply collect 20% on everything you sell. You would submit a monthly statement or form to the tax collection authority. And by the way, you could have this tax collection authority actually done at the state level, or you could have it be done federally. The sales tax legislation that has been offered and discussed in Washington proposes to give a commission for states to actually be the collection agency, and so you wouldn't even need anything remotely resembling the IRS that we have now in Washington. And that literally is it. I mean, I'd love to talk for another hour explaining all the details and intricacies of a national retail sales tax, but there aren't any. We can have a simple tax code if we make a decision that we want to get politicians out of the business of trying to steer our behavior and micromanage the economy. And we can have a simple tax code if we decide that we want a tax system that treats everyone equally. All the complications, all the mess, all the distortions that we have with our current income tax all exist because we have deviated from those principles. And so it's really up to us. Do we want the simplicity? Do we want the fairness? And if we don't get rid of the 16th Amendment, you can get that through a flat tax, or you can get it through a sales tax, and you certainly would only get it through a sales tax if we can somehow get rid of the 16th Amendment. And actually, I do want to give one word of caution. Just getting rid of the 16th Amendment, I fear, is not enough, because we won that case in 1895, the Pollock case, but only by a 5-4 vote. And that was back when the Supreme Court justices probably knew there was such a thing as a Constitution. I worry that if you have people like David Souter deciding this case today, he would say, oh, well, the Constitution already gives us the right to levy an income tax. That decision back in 1895 was a mistake. So I encourage all of us, let's not just fight to put the 16th Amendment 6 feet under the ground in a lead-lined casket surrounded by concrete with salt over the earth. Let's try to put something in the Constitution making it unambiguously clear, so clear that even David Souter can't rule otherwise, that an income tax can never come back to haunt America. Let me go ahead and close, I guess, on an optimistic note. Again, there's not a whole lot more to discuss on a sales tax because it's so simple. I actually think that even if we don't succeed with what we're trying to do with the 16th Amendment and the income tax, that events are moving in our direction. And why do I say this? I say this because of the Internet. And it's not for the reason that was discussed earlier, that information is more freely available. I mean, I think that's great. The American people do have a chance through the Internet of finding things that the elites don't want them to know. But I think the beauty of the income tax of the Internet from the perspective of the income tax is that with each passing year, it is becoming harder and harder and harder for the Internal Revenue Service to enforce a tax code that is so fundamentally broken and corrupt in terms of the values it has. When you have the Internet, all you have to do is just go to one of those search engines and type in tax shelter. And frankly, the number of replies you get will be dictated simply by whatever the maximum capacity is of that server, whether they give you 10,000 replies, 100,000 replies. It used to be that rich people, that the income tax was largely voluntary for rich people in the sense that they could always go to Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, Netherlands Antilles, the Isle of Man. There are all sorts of places that rich people have always been able to go to hide their income and assets from the government, which is one of the reasons why, of course, the class warfare people were always so wrong when they said that we need to have higher tax rates to soak the rich, when, of course, it actually turns out that the supply-siders were right all along. You lower tax rates and the rich wind up paying more because they find it all of a sudden it's not as profitable for them to hide their money overseas and to hide their money in tax shelters. But the point is that the tax shelters and the tax havens and the ways to protect income and assets that used to be an exclusive preserve of the rich are now increasingly becoming more and more something that's available to the average American. Now, I'm not saying that this is fair and right. I do think that laws should apply equally to all, and everyone should obey those laws, assuming that they are moral and just laws. And when you have a tax system that is as bad as the one we have now, and individuals are being able to hide their money and evade the responsibilities they have under the law, that simply creates a more onerous and more oppressive regime among the tax collection authorities and the politicians, because they are trying harder and harder to get that same amount of money. And that, to me, is why I am hopeful. I won't guarantee it by any means, but I am hopeful that the fact that it is becoming increasingly easy for people to hide their money from an unjust and unfair tax system, I'm hoping not because they'll understand what's right, but simply for self-preservation and the desire to keep that money coming in that they can then spend to help themselves get reelected. I am hoping that the politicians will realize we can't keep the income tax anymore. And actually, everyone else gave their website. I want to encourage you to find one thing. We put out a book at the Heritage Foundation, The IRS versus the People. And Richard Rahn, who's actually, and a lot of the chapters, most of them actually focused on flat tax, but one of the chapters was by Richard Rahn, former vice president and chief economist of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And his chapter was on this very topic of how the politicians are going to have no choice but to get rid of the current tax system for this argument of self-preservation. And if you go to www.heritage.org, you can get this book, as well as, of course, all the other papers we've done. I've done a paper, Flat Tax or Sales Tax, Win-Win Choice for America. And, heaven knows we must have hundreds of papers on there. And so if you have lots of time on your hands, feel free to scroll on forever. But I definitely want people to get a hold of the Richard Rahn article in that book, The IRS versus the People, because that chapter, I think, is a very optimistic, very uplifting look at what the Internet is going to mean for finally giving us tax freedom. And I guess in closing, I want to sort of add my words to the spirit that's already been expressed up here. Think back to, 1774? Not only am I not a math genius, but I'm not a history genius either, but I think that's when Lexington and Concord took place. When you had Americans, I guess at that time British subjects, who took up arms against the most powerful empire the world had ever seen because they valued their liberty. And then when you had the Founding Fathers sit down to write the Declaration of Independence, these were people of means. These were the successful people, the elite of their day. And they decided, we're going to go ahead and risk everything. Matter of fact, I'll probably butcher it in paraphrasing it, but they said, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And if they, who had so much and who were the elite of their day, could put everything on the line and risk everything, including their very lives in some cases, in order to fight for freedom, then for heaven's sake, can't all of us not pledge our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honors even, but let's at least give a little bit of time to spread the word about freedom and what freedom would mean and how we can have a tax system that is better than the awful one we have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. One for Larry Beecraft. If I do not file with the IRS and I get a computer-generated letter from them, how do I go about protecting my private property?
Complicated question that's difficult to answer. When you get a computer-generated letter from the IRS, where is your return you haven't filed? Eventually what they're going to do is they're going to send around a special agent if you become one of the people that are targeted for criminal investigation. They could ultimately investigate what you made and bring charges against you. And the alternative, instead of going the criminal route, the government might go, or the IRS might go, the civil route. What they'll do is they'll send you a 90-day letter, drag you into tax court, or you will have to go to tax court, and you'll probably end up with a whole bunch of big bucks that the IRS will attempt to collect from you. Now, in situations like that, you can consult people like Bill Conklin, and they can try to work out some arrangements, try to minimize your damage. All of this will continue. I look across the tax movement and I see a bunch of people that are, like as I described a few moments ago. They want to hide. They want to avoid. Well, if you're not out there actively trying to do something to bring this thing to an end, that type of activity of the criminal investigations and the civil investigations will continue. The only way to stop it is for you to do something. And we can stop it, as I said, let's take 5 years and let's apply ourselves. Let's attack what we perceive as the ills of America. And clearly the tax system is one of the great problems in America. And if we will lift a finger, if we'll do something like the civil rights movement did, they went out there at a very small, or smaller faction of the American people than we are, brought about change in their favor. If you want to avoid getting that little notice from the IRS, if you want to avoid getting that tax bill, if you want to avoid being criminally prosecuted, there is but one way for us to end it. It has to go out there and bring the tax to an end. Nothing more, nothing less.
I have a related question for Bill Conklin. If we do not file a 1040 in April 2000, when contacted by the IRS, how should we then proceed?
Well, like Larry said, the IRS can proceed two ways, both civilly and criminally. And they don't go criminally in most cases, but they do in some. What I suggest in my book, and what I think, is that people have to take an approach that they're comfortable with. I think far too many people in this country do one of either two things. They do nothing, or they jump into an approach they don't understand and take a risk that's too high. The IRS can seize assets. They can garnish your wages down to about $300 a month. They can take your house. They can tow your vehicles away. And if you resist them towing your vehicles away, they can arrest you for interfering with government property and put you in jail. The amount of power they have is absolutely unbelievable. So you've got to understand that when you take this on. So how you respond to that letter depends on what approach you want to use. If you've decided to take an approach as a non-filer, first of all, you should do it on the advice of counsel. You should never do that without having an opinion letter from an attorney. If you have an opinion letter from an attorney stating that you waive your Fifth Amendment rights when you file a return, well, obviously you can't be required to waive your Fifth Amendment rights. One way to respond to that letter, assuming you understand all the implications, which would probably have to be discussed in your individual case. One way to respond to that letter is a cover letter attaching opinion letters from attorneys and other professionals, and that cover letter states, according to counsel, I've filed all required returns and I'm in compliance with the law. Okay? If you write a letter back calling the IRS all kinds of names and stating that you're not going to file returns, anything you say can be used against you in a criminal case. If the IRS needs to prove that you haven't filed a return, it's not too hard to prove it if you write them back a letter and say, I'm not going to file. I didn't file. Unfortunately, a lot of people take very dangerous and very hardcore positions they don't understand. They argue the law with the IRS. Well, the United States Attorney on cross-examination can beat them up real bad because he's going to understand the law better than the individual who's read some $30 book, which is probably wrong on the law anyway. You have to be very careful. In my book, I suggest that if you're an employee, you do not file an exempt or inflated W-4. The reason, and I've worked on dozens of criminal tax cases, the reason that all employees that I've seen have been indicted is because of the exempt W-4, not because of not filing the tax return. And actually, it's an inconsistency to file an exempt W-4 and then not file a return if your argument is the Fifth Amendment, because the government can't require you to file the W-4 either. And if you don't file a W-4 with the employer will call the IRS up and say, what should I do? And the IRS will just say, withhold them at 1 or withhold them at 0. And then if you want to argue a matter of law about the income tax, you can argue that later in a refund lawsuit, which is safer because it puts you in the driver's seat. The individual who wants to take an extremely hardcore position needs to remember the song. I believe it was Janis Joplin that said once, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. The guy who really understands his position, has the advice of counsel, and has nothing left to lose, and is willing to spend a little time in a federal camp if it comes to that, is the only guy that should be on the very front lines of this movement. And that's just the way it is. Unfortunately, I don't think most people understand that, but that is the way it is.
Joe Bannister, don't you have another moment of truth approaching with the information that you now have about the validity of the 16th Amendment and the absence of a statute compelling one to file and pay taxes, income tax? Do you intend to file in April of 2000?
I wonder if a few people will be answering or listening to the answer to this question. Because I think I told you during my speech, and I've told and many people as I've spoken to, I have searched far and wide and used every bit of my own expertise and training to try to find a federal law that requires me to file a federal income tax return. I have not been able to find that law. I've also approached my agency that I used to work for and asked for some clarification. I got a very curt letter that gave me a little report, said your answer's on page 13 and we don't want to talk to you anymore. My plan right now is to not file a tax return in April of 2000 unless or until someone from my government will show me, so that then I can show everyone else where that law is. Is that too much to ask?
That's all for tonight, folks, from the from our guests at the seminar that took place a couple years ago. But I've got quite a few comments to make here. You've heard every one of these people agree that nobody can find a law that requires anybody to file and pay the income tax. Now, these are attorneys, ex-special agents of the Internal Revenue Service. Bill Benson was the chief investigator for his state. He was involved with prosecutors and law enforcement and for most of his life. Now, you've still got some more to hear, and you're going to get that tomorrow night. We're going to postpone the tomorrow night's photography broadcast to finish up this series so that we can go into the following week fresh, and that you won't be sitting there over a weekend forgetting what you heard this week and then listening to the tag end of all of it, because I don't think that's a very good thing to do. We're going to continue this, and you're going to hear some astounding information between now and April the 15th. And excuse me, folks, I've still got that little cold in my throat, and it's making it kind of hard to talk without getting a little phlegm, and so anyway, I hope you will excuse that. My stance has been completely and totally 100% upon the law. You hear these people say that there's no law requiring anybody to file and pay. But most of those people, not all, Bill Benson does not file and pay. I guarantee you that Bob does. I guarantee you that Larry Beecraft does. I guarantee you that a DV Kid does. I guarantee you that most of these people are filing and paying the income tax. Now, that's nothing but sheer cowardice. To bend the knee to tyranny and say we can't find a law and you don't have the right to do this It's unconstitutional. The law is vague. There's due process problems. You're making us violate our Fifth Amendment privilege by causing us to fill out W-4s and W-2s and 1040s and all of this kind of stuff, because in all actuality we're testifying against ourselves. But we all have to work within this crooked, unconstitutional, illegal, and unlawful system, and maybe in 5 years or so, we can get it switched to an unconstitutional, unlawful sales tax, federal sales tax. And people don't sit down and think about these things. They're going on their emotions instead of their intellect. Well, ladies and gentlemen, did you know that the income tax started out at 1% and it was only leveled against corporations? And now look what it is. Do you think if they started a national sales tax off at 7% on top of your state sales tax of 7%, mind you, or 8% or 8.5% or whatever it is in your state, do you really believe in your wildest dreams that it's going to stay at 7%? Are you really so far gone that you really believe that? Because I'll tell you exactly what's going to happen. Every year, they're going to raise the national sales tax until it's worse than any income tax ever could be. And on top of that, it's unconstitutional. They don't have the authority in the Constitution to levy a sales tax against anybody inside the territorial boundaries of any state, or a flat tax. A flat tax is clearly, without any doubt whatsoever, a direct tax upon everybody in the nation. And they can't do that without apportionment amongst the states. And then they can only level the tax against the states, and the states have to come up with the money based upon the population of the state. People don't sit down and think about these things. They go off on these wild tangents. And they think they've got a clue, and they don't. And the biggest problem with all of this is none of them ever sit down and read the Constitution before they start off on these wild goose chases. None of them. Now, I find it absolutely amazing. And they talk about the income tax being a property tax. A property tax upon what? Upon your money. Well, that might be okay if the federal government had the authority in the Constitution to levy a property tax, but they don't. Not within the territorial boundaries of any state. And Federal Reserve notes are not your property. They're the property of the Federal Reserve. They have no value. They are a promise to pay. A note is a promise to pay. And they are issued by the Federal Reserve. But nobody ever gets paid. You can't exchange them for anything of value. When you think you have purchased something with Federal Reserve notes, you have not. You have not. Now, if you don't believe me, go out and look for a patent deed to your automobile. Look for an allodial title to your automobile. You don't have one. What you have is a certificate of title, which means this certifies that a title exists. Well, where is the title? If you own your automobile, how come you don't have it if it's paid off? You don't have it because it belongs to whoever issued those notes that you use to purchase it with that have no value. You see, you can't pay for something and own it with a note that is a promise to pay until the promise is met. And you didn't meet it with a Federal Reserve note. You understand? So you don't own anything. That's why they can levy property taxes against your land and against your home, because you don't own it. The property tax is actually a lease payment while you are occupying that land and that home. Now, if you don't believe me, just miss one payment and see what happens. They can come if they want to and take your land and take your home and auction it off to the highest bidder, and you don't get a penny, even though you may have $200,000 invested in it. You don't get any of those proceeds. Well, if you really owned the land, all that they would really be able to keep would be the taxes that you owed, and they would have to be forced by law to give you anything above that amount. But they don't. And they don't because you forfeited your lease, and they were the ones who actually owned the property all along. Good night, folks. God bless each and every single one of you. Don't miss tomorrow night's broadcast, The Hour of the Time, and from now on out, don't ever miss a broadcast of The Hour of the Time. Good night, Annie, Pooh, and Allison. I love you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to The Hour of the Time. I'm William Cooper. Our photography series is on hold, folks, for right now. We've got more important fish to fry. By God, we're going to fry them. Our series, up until and including April the 15th, is exposing the criminal activities of the unconstitutional, unlawful Internal Revenue Service and their misapplication and tyranny through the use of the federal income tax against the American people. Now, before we get started with the end of the series that we've been running this week, let me remind you that we need your donations. If you get real worth from this broadcast, you must support it. In other words, you got to pay for what you're getting. And for years, over 10 years, I've supported all of our research, everything that we've ever done, and I can't do it anymore. Because of the warrants that the government has issued for my arrest and for the arrest of my wife, in order to try to silence us, I can't go out and get a job. I can't go speak somewhere and get a speaking fee. We can't set up a table at symposiums and conventions and things and sell my book and Oklahoma City Day One and you know, my tapes, broadcast tapes and videotapes and things like that. So the only way that we can continue to do what we've been doing for all these years is if you support this effort. So if you feel that you're getting real worth from this broadcast and from all the work that we do, from the website, from everything that we do, then you need to support it with your donations. So send your donation to HOT, H-O-T-T, in care of 101.1 FM. That's HOT, H-O-T-T, in care of 101.1 FM, P.O. Box 940, Eagar, spelled E-A-G-A-R, Arizona, 85925. That's HOT, H-O-T-T, in care of 101.1 FM, P.O. Box 940, Eagar, Arizona, 85925. Remember, folks, we can only take cash. Blank money orders are gold and silver coin. In any combination you want to make it, we don't care. Those are the only things that we can take. Those are the only things that we can use. If you send a check, I'm just going to throw it in the trash can. It will never be cashed. And so please don't do that. Okay? Well, we left off last night right before the, or maybe they had already asked a couple of questions. I don't remember exactly. But tonight we're going to pick up in the question portion and continue. And, you know, don't feel that that you're not going to get anything out of this, because Bill Benson gets back up and speaks for about a half an hour. And what he says will just absolutely knock your socks off. The man's like me. He has no fear. He drew his line in the sand. He refuses to file. He refuses to pay. And like me, he has challenged them to come after him. So you're gonna want to hear what he has to say. Don't listen to all these people who tell you there's going to be some kind of a political solution. That tell you that if we just keep waking people up and challenging the government and holding these symposiums and having speakers, that the government's going to come around to their senses and they're going to do away with the income tax. Bullshit. If you believe that, you're not playing with a full deck of cards. You're living in fantasy land. You're lost. Because I've been trying that for years, folks. Doesn't work. There's only one way to do it. That's to draw a line in the sand, put a gun in your hand, and say no more. No more. And if necessary, we must rise up in a civil war to restore constitutional Republican government and hang every one of those traitors by the nearest lamppost. Now, if you don't believe me, look back through history, and you'll see that I'm right. Okay? Now, you don't have to believe that, but do some research. And don't quote Gandhi to me. Don't even quote Gandhi to me and tell me that they got away with non-violent civil disobedience. No, an awful lot of poor Indians died during their so-called civil disobedience protests in India. Tens of thousands of people were shot down, killed, clubbed to death. Nobody cared because they were poor Indians. So don't even cite Gandhi to me, and in the end he was assassinated, killed. And guess what the Indians did when they chased the British out? They adopted the exact same form of government that the British taught them and had instituted in India. And ladies and gentlemen, if you had studied India under the rule of Great Britain and study them now, you would see that they were much better off under Great Britain than they've ever been since. And since, they've become very dangerous because they have atomic weapons. Well, enough said. Make sure you have pen and paper. Make sure you've got whatever you need to make yourself comfortable so that you don't have to get up and run back and forth to the kitchen or wherever you've got to go. And listen carefully. You're going to learn an awful lot. And remember, every night until and including April 15th, we're going to be doing this kind of programming. You're going to hear things you never dreamed you would hear from anybody. And we're going to prove to you. And you know, here's my challenge. It's always been there. Listen to everybody. Read everything. Believe absolutely nothing unless you can prove it in your own research, including what I say, or what anybody that you're going to hear as guests on this program say. But let me tell you this. If you can find a law, any law, passed by anybody that requires you or me or anybody else to file and pay the income tax, and you can present it to me, I'll read it on the air, I'll apologize to the world, and I'll be the first one lined up to file and pay my income tax on April 15th. And that's been my challenge for years and years and years. The IRS can't produce it. Congress can't produce it. The senators from the state of Arizona can't produce it. None of the representatives from the state of Arizona can produce it. The police chief, the head of the DPS, the police chief in Springerville, none of these people can produce it. The mayor can't produce it. The president of the United States can't produce it. And I'm going to tell you something else. You can't produce it either, but go and try. Go and try. I hope you can, because if you can, it's a solution to all of this. But you can't. And you won't. And when you find that out, you're going to arrive at a moral dilemma. And you're going to have to sit down and say, there is no law. Cooper can't find it. The president can't find it. The IRS can't find it. And don't forget to call the IRS and ask them. Call the United States attorney where you live and ask him. Call the judge. Ask the judge. Ask your mayor. Ask your senators and your representatives in Washington, D.C. None of them will be able to give you the law. And if they can't, you have a moral dilemma. You're going to have to make a decision. Am I going to bow my knee to tyranny and file and pay on April 15th this terrible extortion, this criminal robbery of me and my family? Am I going to do that? Or am I truly going to be an American and stand up and draw the line and say, no, no more. If you can't produce the law, I'm not going to do it because I don't have to do it. It's not required of me. And there's nothing patriotic, ladies and gentlemen, about filing and paying an income tax, that there is no law that requires you to file and pay, because when you say that, all you're doing is making excuses for your cowardice. And in light of all of these things, if you file and pay on April 15th, you are in fact a miserable coward. And it's beyond me how you can look yourself in the mirror in the morning or how you can face your wife and children because you are complicit to the crime and you are stealing from your own family.
Here's a question for Dan Mitchell. Where does the 20% national tax estimate come from? Without the cost of the bureaucracy of IRS, we should be able to make it much lower, 7 to 10% or lower.
Well, the IRS is a very big bureaucracy, but even once you factor in even the non-IRS tax compliance costs that the government has, you're basically dealing with a maximum figure of $10 to $13 billion, which, considering that we have a budget of, what, $1.8 trillion, frankly, just, getting rid of 95% of the IRS, which a good tax reform plan could do, isn't quite in and of itself going to save enough money to allow a noticeably lower rate. Now, there is another aspect to this, though, which is the fact that you're going to get rid of all the compliance costs imposed upon the private sector. The Tax Foundation here in Washington estimates that the compliance costs of the income tax alone exceed $150 billion. That's the lawyers, the accountants, the man-hours, and so on and so forth, that it simply takes just to get your tax return to Washington. That's not the money you have to, that you actually give the government. That's simply what it costs you to give the money. It's sort of like a tax on a tax. And all that money, or the vast, vast majority, over 90%, again, according to the Tax Foundation, of those costs would disappear under a low, simple, fair tax system like a retail sales tax or a flat tax. And so unquestionably, that's a big amount of money. But again, compared to $1.8 trillion, not going to make a big, big difference. The two things that you have to keep in mind when you're looking at what the rate would be for a low, simple, flat rate tax system, such as a national retail sales tax or a flat tax, the things you have to keep in mind is, how big do you want your government to be? I think we should go back to the enumerated powers that our founding fathers gave to the federal government, and then we wouldn't have a lot of the programs and agencies that the federal government has, and we could have a much, much lower tax rate. But maybe we're not going to win those battles. And then you also have to factor in, when you're setting that tax rate, are we going to consider the real world to be real? And by this, I mean that if you get rid of our current tax code, which punishes work, which punishes savings, which punishes investment, which has these huge compliance costs, you are going to get a faster growing economy. And when you have a low rate and people are working and saving and investing more, and when people are bringing their money back to America from tax shelters and from tax havens, you are going to generate more economic activity, which means you're going to have what's called the supply side effect. Now, the media has demonized that so-called supply side effect, but it's very real and very true. And let me give you just one little set of statistics here. In 1980, when the top tax rate was 70%, the evil rich, the top 1%, were paying 17% of the tax burden. Well, by 1988, the top tax rate had fallen from 70% all the way down to 28%. No question about it. The rich got by far the biggest tax cut during the 1980s. And what did that mean for tax collections from the rich? Remember, in 1980, they were paying 17%. What were they paying in 1988? According to all the class warfare people who said the rich made out like bandits, their share of the tax burden must have dropped to what, 10%, 5%? It turns out that according to IRS data, the top 1% went from paying 17% of the tax burden when the rate was 70% to paying 27% of the tax burden when the rate had dropped to 28%. Unambiguous, clear proof that if you want to soak the rich, cut tax rates and bring them low so people have no incentive to hide, shelter, and underreport their income. And what that shows in sort of a global economic sense is that if you have a low, simple, fair tax system like you get with a retail sales tax or a flat tax, you can have a rate significantly below what's called the revenue neutral static rate, which of course assumes that people don't react to the tax code. And so whether or not it can be 20%, whether it can be 15%, whether it can be 17%, I don't know the exact answer, because we do have to figure out what size of government we should have, and we do have to figure out what the projected new economic activity from a fair low-rate tax system would be. So I picked 20% more just as an illustration, but that will give you a rough idea of where it can be. Let's not forget that the income tax and the payroll tax account for about $1.5 trillion. And to replace that, you're not going to be able to get away with the 10% tax unless you're going to reduce the size of government, which in and of itself, of course, is a good thing.
And there's a question for me. We have attended this very informative symposium, and we would like to know what is next. The IRS and the federal government have refused to acknowledge the invitation to attend and rebut the research presented here today. What happens next? It is very disturbing to me personally and to the foundation that we have presented this evidence to the government, to the president himself, and to the leaders of the two houses of Congress. In May, a very respectful letter submitting copies of these reports and requesting that they be here to participate in the symposium. We need to get to the truth. No response. In early June, a follow-up letter. No response. It's a very serious matter. Jefferson said, when government steps outside of the boundaries that the people have put around government, when they take one step outside, he said, they take possession of a boundless field of power, not capable of definition any longer, no longer capable of definition. So fundamentally, it's a question of sovereignty. Who's sovereign? Are the people sovereign, or is the government sovereign? Can government act unrestrained, outside of the limits that we, the people, have placed around it? Very heavy question. It's not the first time. It's not the first time that government has ignored, turned a blind eye and a deaf ear to the will of the people, as expressed in our constitutions, both state and federal. Government is, in the minds of many, out of control of the people. There is a need to bring them back under control, not just on this issue, but in many other issues. So it's a question, I think, what do ordinary citizens do? Ordinary non-aligned citizens do when they are confronted with governmental wrongdoing. Larry Beecraft, as you have heard, was the attorney representing plaintiffs in a series of cases in 1985 and 86. I have reviewed those cases. I'm in my 20th year of closely evaluating governmental behavior, comparing that behavior with the constitutions, state and federal, and then confronting before the courts improprieties, conflicts, behavior by the government that seems to be outside of these boundaries. So I was very interested on the 16th Amendment, on this issue. What have the courts said? What's happened in the courts? And so I reviewed these cases. I was delighted to see Larry Beecraft's name as an attorney representing plaintiffs in most of those cases, and that's why he's here today. But as I was startled, stunned by what I'd read. It's clear if you read those cases, you line them up and you read one after the other, you see precisely when Bill Benson's evidence first made its way into a case. And when it was first presented, the argument of the attorneys was, there's no 16th Amendment. Look at all these procedural errors. And the courts ruled, Federal Court of Appeals ruled, dismissing the cases based upon a doctrine, the doctrine of conclusive presumption. What they were saying was, look, the Secretary of State back in 1913 declared, proclaimed it ratified. The 16th Amendment was ratified. That's it. Case closed. It was interesting as you read the cases, the attorneys said, went back into court on another case and they introduced another argument. And they said, but the Secretary of State committed fraud in making that proclamation. Now, this is a more serious charge, one that's more difficult for the courts to say, you know, to apply the conclusive presumption argument to, dealing with fraud. And it was in those cases that the Federal Court of Appeals said, this is a political question. Can you imagine? Co-equal independent branch of the government, the judiciary, saying it's a political question. They're presented with the facts. They know what the law is. You apply the law to the facts. That's the job of the court. Fundamental role of the judiciary, in my opinion, is to see that the other two branches, the political branches, are kept in their constitutional places. It's a political question. Go talk to Congress about it. And of course, we heard they went to Congress and they said it's up to the courts. Isn't one of the definitions of treason, I hesitate, I don't like to use the word, but isn't one of the definitions of treason when two or more of the branches work together, cooperate in a collective decision to deny people their constitutional rights? So what to do? Very disturbed that the federal government has not responded, either to Joe or to this foundation. What to do next? Here's what I will be recommending to the board of our foundation, the We the People Foundation for Constitutional Education, and it's the board of its sister agency or sister organization, the We the People Congress. One is an educational organization. Its sister agency, the Congress, is set up to lobby for more engage in political activism. But this is what I will be recommending as a result of what we've heard here today and yesterday. We'll be recommending that we do everything we possibly can in our power to get people across the country to demand that, the way the system is designed to work, if you need reform, you can get reform through the political process. So we should go to the legislative branch and we should put pressure on the branch to hold a congressional hearing on this evidence and to issue a subpoena, get the most knowledgeable people from the government to attend and to argue against these conclusions. They could duck this organization, of course. They can duck the symposium. It'd be more difficult for them to duck a congressional hearing and a congressional summons. But we should also, the way the system is designed to work, so let's respect it, of course. We can get relief, people can get relief through the judicial process. And what has come to mind is the approach that Vietnam veterans took on the Agent Orange issue. individual Vietnam vets that couldn't get anybody's attention, to their plight and to their problem. Individually, they filed lawsuits in federal district courts. It was well coordinated all over the country. Hundreds of lawsuits were filed, basically the same claims by different veterans. And of course, they were all consolidated before the D.C. Circuit. A lot of attention was devoted. Decisions were now being made in the courts with glaring lights, cameras on them. They weren't making any decision in the dark, that was for sure. And the case got to the Supreme Court, and they won. I think maybe we need to do the same thing. People need to file cases in federal district courts across the country, trying to get a declaration, trying to get the courts to do their job, look at the facts, look at the law, what happened, was the 16th Amendment, declare whether it was properly and legally ratified or not, and declare whether or not there is a statute that compels people to file and pay an income tax. We should do that. But this is a very heavy decision, obviously, for the political branches. They're going to need some encouragement, in my opinion, if the political branches refuse, and we continue to get the insults that we've gotten from Congress and the judiciary. Joe Bannister and Bill Benson, Larry Beecraft, Bill Conklin have gotten over the years on this issue, then maybe it will come down to some sort of civil disobedience, a la Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. So as a foundation, I will recommend is that we reserve the large ballroom in this building here at the National Press Club at a day early in September, right after Labor Day. And we invite all of the good government, constitutional activism or constitutional activist organizations at the state level and at the federal level to send representatives to a summit meeting where an attempt is made to put a collective foot down against the tyrants of our day, just as our forefathers did in the Revolutionary War and as Mahatma Gandhi did as well. And between now and then, that day in September, we get this evidence out. We get these arguments out to all of these organizations. We ask them to send a representative. And we attempt to enlist the support of all right-thinking, concerned Americans through these organizations. They have been struggling against one issue or another, governmental wrongdoing in one form or another, for a long time. See if we can't... right is right. Maybe an income tax is the best way. Maybe it is good for America. But we live under the rule of law. Let the people's representatives debate that question, as apparently they did in 1909. And then let's follow the rule of law. Let's get the states to ratify it. But let's not tolerate the current situation any longer. There are simply too many people being hurt. So that's what I will do. That's what this organization will do next. We'll get that word out on our website, givemeliberty.org, get you to the website of these three organizations, the Foundation, the Congress, and another organization called the All County Taxpayers Association. Between those three organizations, which it sort of represents a triple threat offense to governmental wrongdoing, but we'll get the word out, and we will schedule early in September a summit meeting to see if we can't get the support of many Americans behind an effort to get Congress to do their job and to get the courts to do their job, and to be prepared, should they fail to perform the primary role that we've established for them, then to engage in, if we have to, hopefully it'll never come to this, but engage in some sort of civil disobedience. Are there any other questions before we close? Do we have time? Some time. Question, will Bill Benson tell us what he has suffered at the hands of the U.S. government, and what about his health? You told us that you had gathered this evidence at your personal expense and time, and that it was submitted to the courts and to all federal judges, all congressmen. Told us that there was no response, especially from Congress, but what was the court's response? And what happened to you? What's the rest of the story?
The rest of the story, ladies and gentlemen, is that when I did the research on the 16th Amendment, when I filed suit against the state of Illinois for corruption committed in that state, and why I believe that a sales tax that would give the states money to give back to the federal government, in my personal opinion, is wrong. And I can say that from experience, because when I was an investigator for the Department of Revenue, it was my duty and responsibility to collect the excise tax, the tax that you paid when you went to the gasoline station, the grocery stores, the liquor stores, or whatever commodities that you purchased. It was my bitter experience to find that some of these people that were involved in collecting the excise tax that you paid, after they owed about $3 million to $4 million, would come to the Department of Revenue and talk to the attorneys and say, look, let's make a deal. They sold $3 million cases down the river for $250,000. That's my fear with the sales tax. If it goes to the states to collect, the states are going to do nothing more. They'll have more money to play with than they had when I was with the Department of Revenue. When I began to talk about the 16th Amendment, when I began to before the book was even before I even got it from the printer, I was in the Mr. Beecraft's country, Birmingham, Alabama, giving a speech before a large number of people. I had the computer printouts of the research that I did in Volume 1. And I received a call that evening from Mrs. Benson, and she says, it's extremely urgent that you call Washington, D.C. immediately. I had a home telephone number. I had 2 telephone numbers to contact an attorney who worked for a senator. And I said, as far as I'm concerned, I have far more important work than to contact that senator or contact his attorney right now. But I did it the next day. And lo and behold, to my amazement, I was told, and there's a third party witness to the telephone conversation who is a Baptist preacher. The attorney said, Bill, we know what you're doing. You cannot, believe me, he repeated, you cannot permit that book to get into the hands of the kooks out there. I said, Warren, as far as I'm concerned, there may be kooks out here, but the majority of the kooks are in Washington, D.C. and the Capitol. He said, do you not understand what I'm offering you? I says, of course I do. He says, have all the books printed that you want. Name your price. We'll pay it. But then we want all of the certified, notarized documents that you have, and for you never, ever to again speak about the 16th Amendment. And I said no. He said, do you understand you never, ever have to work another day in your life? You can take care of your family. And I said, what about the rest of the people in the country? That's what this is all about. Not just about Bill Benson. It's about my children, my grandchildren, and every one of yours. Every person in this country. I didn't do this piece of research work on the 16th Amendment because I was going to make money off of it. That was not the idea. There hasn't been any money made off of it. Everything's gone right back into what I'm doing as far as traveling, speaking, and etc. When as I told you previously, won my case against state government, it was a bitter blow for them, very bitter. To have one individual like Bill Benson and one lonely attorney win a major case like we did from the state. The state of Illinois spent in excess of $2 million trying to fight and beat me, and they lost. I know the figure because I know where the records are. I know when they hire outside contractors, as far as attorneys are concerned, they must have invoice vouchers that they produce every month, and they must have contracts. So the state of Illinois, the capital of the state of Illinois is Springfield. And I would go to Springfield and pull all the vouchers. So we kind of knew what those lawyers were doing a little bit before they were doing it. After the case was over, the government and one of the attorneys that was involved in the lawsuit, and he was very angry with me because I had arrested his secretary. At that time, we were involved in the excise tax as far as cigarettes are concerned, bringing them from one state to the other. My partner and I did not agree with the law, and we so made our objection to the director. The director said, I want you to go out there on the 3rd and 4th of every month when those elderly people have their Social Security checks and purchase cigarettes and take their cars, lock them up if they have purchased enough. Because the law in the state of Illinois says that if you purchase 10 cartons or more, you're subject to arrest, confiscation of your vehicle, and then you have to go to court within 30 days. I used to post bond for some of these people because I did not agree. I had Chicago policemen, Chicago firemen, ambulance trucks that were coming out to the cigarette stands, and I said, no, this cannot be. If I have to arrest the individual in front of that policeman, behind that policeman, I'm going to arrest that policeman. At one time, I chased a Chicago sergeant in full dress uniform in a Chicago marked police car, and I had a siren and a red light in my car, in an unmarked car. I chased him at 90 miles an hour, and I knew I was going to catch him because he had to go through the toll gates. And we were not both going to go through there at that speed. I think it was foolish of me to do that, but my partner was behind me. He couldn't get ahead of me. When he stepped out of that vehicle, he says, "Don't you understand who I am? Do you see these stripes?" I said, "Sergeant, the only thing I want from you is your driver's license and your identification." I said, "I know how much you have purchased as far as cigarettes are concerned. You haven't purchased enough to break the law, or else your squad car would go into the sheriff's audit pond like everyone else's, and you would go to your precinct and be locked up in your own jail." That wasn't bold, I don't think. It wasn't trying to be a hero or a martyr or anything of the sort. It was being fair with each and every individual. Ambulances had no business out there. So, yeah, federal government, state government were very, very angry at Bill Benson. And in 1981, I had an insurance company settlement. And the attorney that worked the case that we won wrote a letter to the first assistant United States attorney, Joan Bainbridge Safford in Chicago. And he says, "Dear Joan, I believe I know how to get these turkeys, including my lawyer and myself." He says, "and I'll help you in every way I can." So I was indicted for willful failure to file income tax returns for the year of 1980 and 81. I didn't have to file returns. There was no requirement to file returns for those years as far as that money is concerned. But they got to the insurance company. The insurance agent took the witness stand, and my attorney asked him, "Where is Mr. Benson's W-2, W-4? Where are all of his credentials that he has from your company? I want to see everything." He put his head down for a couple of minutes, and he said, nothing, for at least 2 minutes. The attorney said, "Do you not understand my question?" And he says, "Yes." He said, "I lied when I testified before the grand jury." With that case should have been thrown out, period. But it was not. Judge Paul Plunkett said maybe he lied and maybe he didn't after the jury was sent out of the room, and there was a big argument. And then, of course, the transcript was read back from the court reporter. And he says, "This case is going ahead." To make it a little bit shorter, the jury did find me guilty because I didn't file a tax return. And I spent 15 months and 5 days in prison in Rochester, Minnesota. After 15 months and 5 days, the appellate court for the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals reversed my case. The government was still going to get me one way or the other if they could. They went to the judge and said that Mr. Benson has filed an appeal before the appellate court. It would be like O.J. saying, I have just been found not guilty. Let's try it again. Maybe you can find me guilty. When you have a reversal like that, when your case is reversed, you win. The government has to go back in to the appellate court and try and win their case back against you so maybe they can prosecute you. And they did that. They not only went to the three-judge panel, they were denied after a period of time. They went to the en banc panel, then the proper panel to go through, and they were also denied. Then they went to the clerks of the court. Instead of going to the Supreme Court, was our only option, and said, we want you to set this case for a new trial. And the clerk says, no, we cannot, because it's been reversed. So they went to one judge in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge Mannion. Judge Mannion then changed the order and said it shall now read reversed and remand. So I find myself back into court a second time. Now I'll back up a little bit, because the first time I was in prison, in 1968, I became ill with encephalitis. That's caused by a mosquito bite. And a lot of times it causes you to have seizures. It causes you to sleep a long time during a day, maybe 2 days at a time or so. And the government and the institution knew that. I was doing very, very well with the prescribed medication by the doctors. But when I got into the institution, they took the medication away. And they said, we're going to give you something that's going to take care of your problem. I said, no, you're not. I'm not going to accept it. I had 4 guards walk into my room, because they didn't call your room a cell. It was a room. It was something you took care of, if you could, and the whole thing. And the 4 guards held me down. 3 nurses came in. 3 nurses were all over my body. And when I got hit with the needle, that was goodbye. The inmates got a hold of my small telephone book and called Mrs. Benson and told her, you better get into this institution to find out what's happening to Bill. I had edema so bad I was 3 times the size that I am now. They couldn't put clothes on me. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear. I couldn't walk. I couldn't talk. When Mrs. Benson got in, the doctors and the warden fought like crazy to keep her from seeing me. But she fought just as hard, and she got to see me. My daughter was 38 years old, and I didn't know her. When the question was asked, would I do it all over again? You bet I would. In a heartbeat. There is no question about it. Because this issue of the income tax, the 16th Amendment, the government cannot prove me wrong. From 1981 to present day, I haven't been bothered by any of them. From 1981 to present day, no one has said, Mr. Benson, where's your tax return? No one has come to the door, knocked on the door, and said, Mr. Benson, we want to talk to you. No one. Who is right? Are they right? I personally made a copy of all 17,000 documents for the federal court, for the judge, and for the prosecutor. And they still have them in their possession since 1987. See, they indicted me for 1980 and 1981, but not until April 13th of 1987. I was their poster boy because of the publicity as far as Volume 1 is concerned. That gave them a lot of problems. No ifs, ands, buts, or questions about it. It was a horrible experience to go through because I ended up in a wheelchair for 2 years for fighting for what was right, for fighting for what I proved, for fighting for what I knew they could not disprove.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have to make a correction here. A few minutes ago, Bill Benson said the first time he was in prison in 1968. He meant to say 1988. And that's the story that he was talking about. He's an old man. And when you see the videotape, and by the way, you can order it from us at the same address I gave earlier for $20 post-paid to your door, the 2 videotape set for $20. But you'll see on the videotape that all of these years of fighting the government has taken its toll on Bill Benson. The correct year was 1988, not 1968.
Any sort of a bribe from a government official. That was not going to happen. 2 years was a long time, 15 months and 5 days in the institution. The parole board on September the 27th had already paroled me, but the appellate court had reversed the jury's guilty verdict. And what did they say? I want you to listen to this. The judge had abused his discretion in permitting the testimony to go on the way he did. He tainted the minds of the jurors by listening to the IRS special agents. We must reverse Benson. So, when I left that institution, then I found myself back into court again. We went back in, and I was tried a second time, found guilty again the second time. Same old, same case, same everything. Denial of due process. We have heard denial of due process for the last couple of days, and that's exactly what they did. Denial of due process. We argued due process with the judge, with the United States Attorney's Office for many, many months. We were in court in September of last year, and we had explained to the judge I had served all my time. You cannot do anything, because they wanted to put me back in prison for 22 days. And they did. And they then sent me to Fort Worth, Texas. Fort Worth, Texas said, we believe there's a very serious problem here, and this institution is not going to become involved in a false imprisonment lawsuit. And the receiving and discharge clerk says, nor either am I. We now have an order from Judge Grady that says it was unlawful for me to put Mr. Benson in prison. It was unlawful for me to put Mr. Benson on 5 years of probation because, you see, they wouldn't let me leave the Northern District of Illinois to talk to people like you, to go anywhere, to even visit my children, my grandchildren in the state of Michigan, Arizona, and California. They refused to permit me to go anywhere. Now, on my desk at home is a lawsuit prepared against these government officials. And as soon as I get home, I will be in federal court and file it. So David can beat Goliath. Thank you.
We do salute.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for tonight. But let me tell you something that in the federal court system, as far as income tax goes, David cannot beat Goliath. David never has. While 10 or 20 people a year may be acquitted in tax court, hundreds of thousands are destroyed. Their businesses are destroyed. Their families are destroyed. Husbands and wives are divorced. Children are taken from families. Husbands and wives are thrown into prison. Some people commit suicide because everything they've worked for in their entire life is destroyed right before their very eyes. They become a criminal in the eyes of their children and their family. You have no idea the devastation, the desolation that the criminal Internal Revenue Service has wreaked upon this nation against people who were never required to file and pay the income tax in the first place. And if you don't believe that, you bring me the law passed by anybody that requires you, me, or anyone else to file and pay the income tax. And if you can't do that, you're faced with a moral question. Am I a miserable coward, and am I going to continue to file and pay? Or am I going to stand with Bill Cooper and Bill Benson and other people who have got great moral character and who really care about this country? And am I going to be willing to give my life for my country, to resist tyranny? And if you're not, and if you file and pay on April 15th, you're nothing but a stinking, rotten, crawling, slave, miserable coward. And that's the truth. Good night, folks. God bless each and every single one of you. Good night, Annie, Pooh, and Allison. I love you. I miss you. I dream of you.